Widow rancher. Had lost all hope until one day. Orphan knocked on her door. She had given up on everything. The farm, the future, even the sunrise that crept through her cracked windows each morning. Evelyn Carter sat on her porch, staring at the withered fields that once fed half the county. But when that small figure appeared at her gate, clutching nothing but a torn satchel and a hope she had forgotten existed, everything was about to change. The boy could not have been more than 12, his clothes hanging loose on his thin frame like hand-me-downs from a much larger child. His hair was the color of wheat before harvest, matted and unwashed, but his eyes held something Evelyn had not seen in years, determination, mixed with desperation. He stood at her gate, not daring to step onto her property, just waiting. Evelyn watched him from her chair, the same chair where she had spent the last 3 years watching the world decay around her. The fence posts leaned at dangerous angles, the barn door hung from a single hinge, and weeds had claimed what used to be her vegetable garden. She had let it all rot, just like she had let herself rot after losing everything that mattered. The boy shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly hungry and exhausted. His satchel looked like it might contain everything he owned, which probably was not much. Evelyn had seen his type before, orphans from the failed settlements, children left behind when families moved on to better prospects or died trying to reach them. She should have ignored him. She should have gone inside and closed the door, like she did with everyone else who came looking for work, for charity, or just for a bit of human kindness. But something about the way he stood there, not begging, not demanding, just hoping, made her feet move before her mind could stop them. Evelyn walked to the gate, her boots crunching on the dry grass. Up close, she could see the boy's face was streaked with dirt and exhaustion, but he met her eyes without flinching. Most people could not look at her anymore. The bitter widow who had turned her back on the world. The boy spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper, but steady as stone. He said he had walked for 2 days, that someone in town told him she might need help with the farm. He did not mention food or shelter, did not ask for pity. He offered to work. Evelyn felt something twist in her chest, something she thought was dead and buried with her family. The boy was offering to save her farm when she had already decided it was not worth saving. He was offering hope when she had made peace with despair. But Evelyn Carter had learned that hope was dangerous. Hope was what killed her husband when he ventured into that storm to save their livestock. Hope was what killed her children when the fever swept through the valley. She was about to turn away, to go back to her chair and let the boy find his hope somewhere else. But then she saw something that stopped her cold. The boy's hands were shaking, and not from the morning chill. Evelyn opened the gate. She told herself it was just for one meal, just long enough to send him on his way with some bread and water. But as the boy stepped onto her property, she noticed his left leg dragged slightly behind the right. He was injured, or maybe born that way. Yet he had walked 2 days to get here. The boy introduced himself as Jackson, though he did not offer a last name. Evelyn did not ask for one. In her experience, people who ended up at her gate usually had reasons for keeping their past to themselves. She led him toward the house, watching how he took in every detail of the place. The broken fence, the collapsed chicken coop, the fields that had not seen a plow in years. Most people looked at her farm with pity or judgment. Jackson looked at it like he was seeing possibilities. Evelyn pushed open the front door and the hinges screamed in protest. The inside of the house was as neglected as the outside. Dust covered everything, and the fireplace had not seen a flame in months. She had been living off cold beans and stale bread, eating just enough to keep herself alive, for no particular reason, but something about having another person in her space made her see it through different eyes. The boy was probably looking at her life and wondering how someone could let everything fall apart so completely. Evelyn felt a flush of shame she had not experienced in years. She moved to the kitchen and began pulling together what passed for a meal. Some bread that was only slightly stale, a jar of preserves from better times, and water from the well that thankfully still ran clean. As she worked, she could feel Jackson watching her, not with judgment, but with something else, something quieter, something like belief, that looked almost like gratitude. The boy ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it might be his last. Evelyn Carter found herself eating too, the first real meal she had shared with another person since her neighbor stopped checking on her last winter. They ate in silence, But it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that comes when two people understand something about being alone. When they finished, Jackson cleared his throat. He asked if he could look at the barn, said he had worked with livestock before, and maybe could tell her what needed fixing. Evelyn almost laughed. Everything needed fixing. But she nodded and followed him outside. The barn was worse than the house. The roof had partially collapsed, and weeds grew through the gaps in the floorboards. But Jackson walked through it like he was surveying a construction project, pointing out which beams were still solid, which walls could be repaired, where new support posts might go. Evelyn watched him and felt something dangerous stirring in her chest again. The boy was talking about her farm like it had a future, like she had a future. But then Jackson said something that changed everything. He mentioned that he had heard about her in town, about what had happened to her family. He said he was sorry for her loss, but then he added something no one had ever said to her before. He said he understood what it meant to lose people, because he had lost people too. The way he said it made Evelyn realize this was not just any orphan looking for work. This was a boy who had seen the same kind of darkness she had been living in. Evelyn stared at the boy for a long moment, seeing something in his eyes she recognized all too well, the weight of grief that never truly goes away, just learns to hide better. She asked him who he had lost, though part of her was not sure she even wanted to hear the answer. Jackson's voice got quieter when he talked about his family. His parents had died in a wagon accident 2 years ago, and he had been living with his uncle since then. But his uncle had recently remarried, and his new wife made it clear there was no room for another mouth to feed, especially one that could not work as hard as the other children because of his leg. The boy said it matter-of-factly, without an ounce of self-pity. But Evelyn felt anger rise in her throat. She knew what it felt like to be abandoned by the very people who were supposed to care. After her family died, the neighbors had brought food and kind words for a few weeks. Then they had gradually stopped coming, especially when she made it clear she did not want their comfort. But this was different. This was a child being discarded because he was no longer convenient. Evelyn surprised herself by asking Jackson if he had anywhere else to go. He shook his head, then quickly added that he did not expect charity. He could work for his keep, he insisted. He was stronger than he looked, and his leg did not slow him down as much as people assumed. As if to prove his point, Jackson moved toward a fallen beam in the barn and began trying to lift it. The thing was easily twice his weight, but he struggled with it anyway, his face tightening with effort. Evelyn watched him strain against the impossible task and felt something break open inside her chest. She told him to stop, not because she thought he could not do it, but because watching him try so hard to prove his worth reminded her too much of herself in the months after the funeral. Always trying to prove she could handle the farm alone, always failing, always pushing everyone away when they offered help. Jackson let go of the beam and looked at her with those two old eyes. He asked if that meant she did not want him to stay. The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Evelyn had spent 3 long years convincing herself that she was better off alone, that caring about people only led to losing them. That hope was just another word for the pain that comes before everything falls apart. But standing in her broken-down barn with this broken-down boy, she realized something that terrified her. She was tired of being alone. And maybe, just maybe, he was too. But before she could answer his question, they heard the sound of horses approaching fast. Multiple riders coming hard toward the farm. Jackson's face went pale, and he grabbed Evelyn's arm with surprising strength. He whispered that they needed to hide, because the people coming were not here to help. Evelyn pulled Jackson behind a stack of old hay bales, just as 3 riders thundered into her yard. Through gaps in the barn wall, she could see them clearly. Hard men with even harder eyes, the kind who made their living, taking things that did not belong to them. The leader was a tall man with a scar running from his ear to his jaw, and he was looking around her property like he was measuring it for something. Jackson was trembling beside her, and Evelyn Carter realized these were not random drifters. They were looking for him specifically. She whispered, asking what he had done, but Jackson shook his head frantically. He said he had not done anything wrong, but his uncle owed these men money, a lot of money, and when his uncle could not pay, they decided to take it out on the boy instead. The scarred man dismounted and called out to the house, saying he knew someone was here because the gate was open and there were fresh footprints in the yard. His voice carried the kind of casual menace that came from years of getting what he wanted through fear. He said they were looking for a boy, and they were not leaving without him. Evelyn felt rage build in her chest, the first real emotion she had felt in years that was not grief or despair. These men wanted to hurt a child to settle a debt that was not even his. They wanted to destroy what little hope had found its way back into her life. She told Jackson to stay hidden and started to stand, but the boy grabbed her arm again. He begged her not to get involved, said these men were dangerous, that she did not understand what they were capable of. He would rather go with them than see her get hurt because of him. But Evelyn was already moving. She had lost everything once because she had been too weak to fight for it. She would not lose something again because she was too scared to try. She walked out of the barn and faced the 3 men standing in her yard. The leader smiled when he saw her, the kind of smile that never reached a man's eyes. He said they were looking for a boy, about 12 years old, probably injured, definitely running from responsibility. He said if she was hiding the boy, things would go easier if she just handed him over. Evelyn looked at the man and felt something she had not felt in 3 years, protective fury. She told him there was no boy here, just a broken-down widow trying to mind her own business. The man's smile widened, and he said he could smell lies just as well as he could smell fear. One of the other riders started toward the barn, but Evelyn stepped into his path. She said this was her property, and he had no right to search it without cause. The man laughed and pushed past her, but Evelyn grabbed his arm and held on. The scarred leader's expression changed, and Evelyn saw the violence in his eyes before he even spoke. He said she was making a mistake, that harboring a runaway boy was going to cost her more than she could afford to pay. He looked around at her failing farm and said it looked like she did not have much left to lose anyway. But that was when Jackson stepped out of the barn with his hands raised. He said he would come peacefully, if they left Evelyn alone. The boy was trying to save her, just like she had been trying to save him. Evelyn realized they were both about to make the same mistake, sacrificing themselves for someone else's safety. But she also realized something that made her heart race with both possibility and terror. She stepped between Jackson and the scarred man, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and steel-willed resolve that she had not felt since her family was alive. She looked at the boy who had walked 2 days to offer her hope, then at the men who wanted to crush it, and made a choice that even surprised her. She told the men that Jackson worked for her now, that he was under her protection, and if they had a debt to collect, they could settle it with his uncle directly. The scarred leader laughed, a sound like gravel grinding against rusted metal. He said a broke widow was not in any position to protect anyone, especially not from the kind of men who collect debts with interest. But Evelyn turned and reached into the house, emerging with something that made all 3 men pause. A rifle. Her late husband's rifle. She had forgotten she even owned it until that very moment, but her hands remembered how to hold it steady. She said the boy stayed with her, and that was the end of the discussion. The tension stretched between them like a wire pulled tight, about to snap. Evelyn could see Jackson's face pale with fear, but also something else. Gratitude mixed with disbelief, as if he could not quite believe someone would fight for him. The scarred man studied Evelyn's face, searching for weakness, hesitation, anything. But apparently, he found neither. If you were Evelyn, what would you do? Would you hold your ground and risk a gunfight you probably could not win? Or would you let them take Jackson to keep yourself safe? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what happened next changed everything. Evelyn Carter knew that what she decided next would determine whether either of them saw another sunrise. She cocked the rifle, and the sound echoed across her yard like a thunderclap. For a moment, everything was perfectly still. The scarred man's hand twitched toward his gun, but stopped when he saw something in Evelyn's eyes, something that told him she was not bluffing. She had already lost everything worth losing. She had nothing left to fear. The standoff felt like it lasted forever, though it was probably only a few tense seconds. Finally, the scarred man remounted his horse. He said this was not over, that the boy's uncle's debt was now her debt, and debts always got collected, one way or another. He warned they would be back, when she was alone, when she did not have that rifle handy. But Evelyn surprised him again. She said she knew every rancher within a day's ride, and if anything happened to her or the boy, they would know exactly who to blame. It was a bluff. Most of her neighbors had written her off years ago, but her voice carried enough conviction to make the men think twice. The riders turned and left, but their parting words carried a promise of violence that hung in the air like smoke after a shot. Evelyn slowly lowered the rifle, her hands now shaking after the danger had passed. Jackson stared at her like she had just performed a miracle. He asked why she had risked her life for someone she barely even knew. Evelyn looked at him and realized she didn't have a good answer, except that, for the first time in 3 years, someone had needed her. But as the dust settled from the rider's departure, Evelyn caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. One of the riders had circled back and now sat watching them from the ridge above her property. He was too far to be an immediate threat, but close enough to track their every move. She realized these men were not just debt collectors. They were hunters, and they had marked their prey. Jackson saw him too, and sank down onto the porch steps, like all the strength had drained out of his body. He said he should never have come here, that he had brought nothing but danger to someone who had already suffered enough. He began gathering his few belongings, saying he would leave before dark and draw the men away from her. But Evelyn surprised herself again. She sat down beside him and told him he was not going anywhere, not because she was being charitable, but because, for the first time in years, she was being selfish. For 3 long years, she had been waiting to die, going through the motions of living without any real reason to keep going. But now, she had something to fight for again, and she was not ready to give that up. Jackson looked at her like she had lost her mind. He said those men would not just disappear. They would keep coming until they got what they wanted. And what they wanted was him, dead or alive, to send a message to anyone else who dared run from a family debt. Evelyn stood up and looked toward the ridge, where the watcher still sat silhouetted against the sinking sun. She said maybe it was time to stop running and start fighting back. But first, she needed to understand exactly what they were up against. She asked Jackson to tell her everything about his uncle's debt, how much money, what kind of business, and why these particular men were involved. The boy's story came out in slow, painful pieces, like splinters being pulled from a wound. His uncle had borrowed money to buy cattle that later died during a brutal winter. When he couldn't repay it, he borrowed again to buy seed that failed during a drought. Each loan came with heavier interest and meaner lenders. The scarred man's name was Vance, and he worked for someone who practically owned half the county through loans like these. People who couldn't pay lost their land, their livestock, sometimes their lives. Jackson's uncle had signed papers putting up everything he owned as collateral, including legal guardianship of the boy. Evelyn felt sick. These men didn't just want money. They wanted ownership of Jackson's body, his labor, even his future. They could sell him off, work him to death, or kill him to make an example. The debt was just a cover. They thought no one would fight for a forgotten, limping boy. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They thought a broken-down widow would be too scared, too hollow, to stand in their way. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Evelyn made Jackson help her drag furniture in front of the windows. They checked all the doors, making sure they were locked tight. She cleaned her late husband's rifle with shaking hands and counted the bullets. 12 shots. Enough for trouble, but not enough for war. Jackson asked her what they were going to do when the men came back. Evelyn looked at him and realized she had no plan beyond this. She wasn't going to surrender. And maybe, sometimes, refusing to surrender was plan enough. That night, they took turns. Evelyn Carter sat by the window, the rifle balanced across her knees, listening to every creak and whisper in the darkness. Jackson slept in restless fits, jerking awake at every sound as the old house settled around them. Just past midnight, Evelyn saw lights moving in the distance, multiple torches, heading toward her farm in a slow, deliberate line. The men were coming back, and this time they had brought reinforcements. Evelyn woke Jackson and positioned him at the back window while she stayed at the front. The torches were drawing closer now, and she counted at least 6 of them. Vance had brought extra men, likely believing that a show of force would be enough to shatter her resolve. But as the lights crept nearer, something unexpected happened. The torches split into 2 groups, with several riders veering off toward her neighbor's property to the east. Evelyn's heart dropped. She understood immediately. Vance wasn't just coming for Jackson. He was blocking off any chance of help. He was making sure she'd stand alone. From the back of the house, Jackson whispered that he could see riders surrounding the property on all sides. They were trapped, outnumbered, and entirely cut off. His voice cracked as he apologized, saying he never should have come here, that he had brought nothing but danger to a woman who had already suffered too much. Evelyn told him to be quiet and keep watching. Her mind was racing. She needed a plan. Something, anything, that could tilt the odds even slightly in their favor. Then she remembered something her husband used to say. A cornered animal is the most dangerous one, because it has nothing left to lose. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder. Soon she could see the riders clearly in the moonlight. Vance was in the lead. 7 men total, more than she hoped for, but fewer than she feared. They stopped just outside her gate. Vance called out to the house, his voice oily with false diplomacy. He said he had brought friends to help settle their business, peacefully. All she had to do was send the boy out, and they'd leave her property untouched. He warned that fighting would only make things worse for everyone, especially for Jackson. Evelyn's answer was simple. She raised the rifle and fired a shot into the dirt near Vance's horse. The animal reared, whinnying in panic, and several of the riders reached for their weapons. But Vance raised his hand to stop them, urging calm. He said that firing at them was a declaration of war, and wars always came with casualties. That's when Evelyn played her final card. She shouted that she had sent word to the territorial marshal, informing him that armed men were threatening landowners over fraudulent debts. It was a bluff, but her voice held the kind of authority that made several riders glance around nervously. Vance, however, wasn't fooled. He called her bluff, saying the nearest marshal was 3 days away, and by the time he showed up, they'd be long gone. Then, without another word, he dismounted and began walking toward the house, his men following in a silent, unified march. The time for talking was over. Evelyn took careful aim and put her second shot into the gatepost, just inches from Vance's head. He didn't flinch. He kept walking. He told her she only had so many bullets, and he had all night. But then something changed. A new voice rang out from the darkness, firm and commanding, telling everyone to halt. Evelyn's heart leapt. Hope ignited inside her. But when she saw who emerged from the shadows, that hope turned instantly to dread. It wasn't help. It was Jackson's uncle, and he wasn't alone. The man rode into the torchlight with 2 others behind him, and Evelyn recognized the family resemblance immediately. The same pale, wheat-colored hair as the boy, but the uncle's face was drawn and tired, shaped by too many compromises and not nearly enough courage. This was the kind of man who would sell a child to save himself. But what made the moment truly devastating was seeing who rode beside him. The territorial judge, the one who handled debt collection and property seizures, the man who could make everything Vance was doing suddenly, legally, bulletproof, with just a signature. Vance smiled as the newcomers joined them, like pieces of a puzzle locking into place. He said Jackson's uncle had come to reclaim what was his and settle his accounts properly. The judge nodded solemnly and announced he was there to witness and authorize the legal transfer of guardianship, to ensure all debts were settled according to territorial law. Jackson's face appeared beside Evelyn's in the window. She saw the heartbreak written all over him. His uncle hadn't just abandoned him, he had sold him, to clear his own slate. The boy's last hope of family had just shattered. It evaporated in front of his eyes. Jackson's uncle called out to the house, saying the boy needed to come out and face his responsibilities. He claimed the boy belonged to him legally, and that Evelyn Carter had no right to interfere in family business. His voice carried shame, but not enough to stop him from going through with it. Evelyn felt rage boil inside her, not the kind of wild, thrashing anger, but the kind that burned clean and hot. She had seen men like this before, cowards who destroyed others just to save themselves. She told him any man who would trade a child to cover a debt had no right to call himself family. The judge cleared his throat, trying to bring order with the weight of the law. He stated that, sentiment aside, the law was clear. The boy was legally tied to his guardian's debts. Interfering with a debt collection was a territorial offense. He gave Evelyn 1 minute to release the child or face charges herself. But Evelyn had already made her decision. She told them all, Vance, the judge, the uncle. They could go straight to hell. The uncle looked stunned, genuinely surprised, as if he expected her to see reason the moment official authority arrived. He said she was only making things harder for everyone, especially for Jackson. If she really cared about the boy, she would let him do what needed to be done. That was when Jackson spoke up, from inside the house. His young voice cut through the night like a blade. He called his uncle a coward and a liar. He said he'd rather die than go with him. He said Evelyn was the only family he had now. The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow. This broken boy with nowhere to go was choosing her over his own blood. He was ready to stand and die beside her, rather than surrender to the people who were supposed to protect him. Evelyn made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just 3 days ago. She stepped out onto the porch with her rifle raised and told every man out there to get off her land. Jackson wasn't going anywhere, and if anyone wanted to take him, they'd have to go through her first. Vance's patience finally snapped. He drew his gun and snarled that he was done playing games with a crazy widow. But before he could fire, Evelyn's shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him backward and slamming him into the dirt. Chaos erupted. The other men scattered, drawing weapons and ducking behind whatever cover they could find. The judge's horse bolted, carrying him away from the chaos he had helped cause. Jackson's uncle crouched behind Vance's fallen horse, yelling for everyone to stop shooting, but the damage was already done. Vance screamed orders from the ground, bleeding and furious. His men closed in around the house. Evelyn had maybe 10 shots left, and at least 6 men still standing. Then Jackson appeared beside her, limping but determined, gripping her husband's old pistol. He said if they were going to make a stand, they were going to make it together. The final battle for both of their futures had begun, and sometimes fighting for something worth saving mattered more than winning. The gunfight lasted 20 minutes. By the time it was over, Evelyn's bullets had brought down 2 more of Vance's men and wounded a third. The survivors, including Vance himself, retreated into the shadows, dragging their wounded and shouting threats about returning with more men. But they never came back. Word spread quickly across the territory about the widow who had stared down armed debt collectors to protect a broken boy. And soon, territorial authorities began asking very uncomfortable questions about Vance's operation. The judge vanished from public view, likely to avoid explaining his role in the attempted seizure. Jackson's uncle tried one more time to reclaim him, this time through legal channels. But Evelyn had already hired a lawyer, using money she had tucked away for years, saved in case of real need. The case was thrown out when it was revealed that the uncle had signed over guardianship to cover gambling debts, something not recognized under territorial law. And then, life began again. Evelyn and Jackson rebuilt the farm together in the months that followed. The boy's leg slowed him down, but his grit more than made up for it. Together they planted new crops, repaired the barn, and slowly breathed life back into land that had been left to rot. Evelyn never remarried. Jackson never left. They became the family neither one of them ever expected to find again. The broken widow who had forgotten how to hope, and the orphan boy who reminded her what was still worth fighting for. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel now, and click on the next video on your screen, because the story waiting there has a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon.